Welcome everybody to this exciting Arctic Passion online seminar on storytelling in science. We got a lot of interest in response to our announcements, and we are very happy to see you all here and that we can now devote ourselves to this exciting topic together today. This seminar is actually a kickoff seminar of the Arctic Passion online seminar and dialogue series. And the series will continue until 2025. My name is Lisa Großfeld, and I'm project officer at the APEX project office at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. And APEX is the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. And as APEX, we are responsible for the education and training activities in the Arctic Passion project. And today I have the pleasure to welcome also one of my close colleagues from GRID-Arendal in Norway, Sabrina Herima, who's also strongly involved in the Arctic Passion project, and they're responsible for the whole project communication. And I'm especially happy to welcome also our expert for today, Olivia Rempel, who is also working at GRID-Arendal, and she's a documentary filmmaker and multimedia journalist. She does everything between producing, shooting, and editing documentaries. And also she's teaching a mini course on science communication at the Technical University of Denmark. So welcome, Olivia, and thank you already for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. Just for those of you who are not too familiar with the Arctic Passion project, I'll just say a few words on that. So generally, the Arctic Passion project is a 4-year EU project that aims at creating a coherent, integrated observing system in the Arctic, and there to monitor environmental changes in these regions. The focus of the project is really lying on the co-creation with local and indigenous communities, and that the observing system services are suitable for end users' needs. And this seminar is, as I mentioned before, part of an online seminar series of our project. And with this series, we aim to inflate a more inclusive and proactive dialogue with people from different groups, backgrounds, and career levels. And we want also to share our experiences, results, and generally to report on the progress of our project. Now I'd like to just say a few words technically about this webinar. So please note all that this webinar is being recorded, and it also is later on posted on the APEX Vimeo channel and the Arctic Passion YouTube channel. And if you have any questions like during or after the talk, you can post them preferably in the chat, but you can also use the Q&A box at the bottom. Sabrina will monitor the chat and also the Q&A, and will drop the questions after Olivia's finished with the presentation, and we'll have a small discussion round where all your questions will be answered. Now, shortly, I will send you a short poll with questions, which will help us just to get to know you a little bit better, and it would be really cool when you can answer them. And with that, I want to hand over to Olivia. Please, Olivia, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for this 2-part webinar series. So in part 1, storytelling in science, the goal is to help you think like a journalist and a storyteller. So this section is all about finding and framing your story, but part 2, media production in the field, will be all about what you need to do once you've identified your story and how to gather the necessary media. Normally, when I've given different versions of this presentation, I've made it very interactive, but because is so much interest in this webinar, we'll be taking all the questions at the end, but please do send them as they come up. So first off, you may be wondering, how do I find a story in the first place? Stories are specific. And I find that one of the biggest pitfalls in storytelling is that people confuse topics for stories. So people will get excited about storytelling and they'll say, okay, I want to write a story about the Arctic. But I would say this isn't a story, this is a topic. So let's narrow it down. Maybe you say, I want to write a story about wildfires in the Arctic. So you've gotten a little more specific. You've narrowed down to include an issue that's happening in a region, but this still isn't a story. This is still a topic. But one example under this topic could be how a UN report reveals an increased risk of wildfires in the Arctic, just to plug some of the important work that my colleagues are doing. So here you have a very broad topic. Then you have a slightly more specific topic, and then you have the actual story. Now you may be wondering, how do I know that it's specific enough that I have a story and not a topic? Well, a first jumping off point is to ask yourself 6 questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and sometimes how. And if you can answer these questions, then it's specific enough that it moves from topic to story. So I'll use the Arctic wildfire story as an example. So the who is UN researchers. The what, they put together a report about wildfires. The when, last month. The where, well, the report covers a number of regions, but we're specifically interested in the impacts on the Arctic region. Why? Because previously the Arctic has not been a hotspot for wildfires. And finally, the how. Global climate change is impacting the whole globe, but especially the Arctic, which is increasing the prevalence of wildfires. So if you can answer these questions, then you know you've got a story. But just because you can answer them doesn't necessarily make your story a good story. So now we're going to get into the 10 elements of newsworthiness. So if your story idea has any of these elements, then it's a newsworthy story. But a great story will have more than one of these elements. So the first element, and they're in no particular order, is proximity. So this is basically local news. So just to poke a little bit of fun at Iceland for a moment. So a few years ago, I was following a local English language newspaper in Reykjavik, and they had a story about how a boy got bitten by a rat. So this is a great example of a story that has proximity to Reykjavik. And so it would be local news for them with proximity. But I don't think the New York Times would run this piece. So it depends on your region. So practically, the way to think about whether a story has proximity is, say you're a researcher from France, for example, and you're doing research in Greenland. So your work will have an element of proximity in both France, because that's where you're from, and also Greenland, because it's local research that's happening in Greenland. So if people want to have fun and write some examples in the chat, I'm going to power through the examples that I have, but I'm sure that you all have some great examples as well. So the second one is prominence. So basically, if someone is famous, whatever they do is automatically more interesting. So prominence can be subjective depending on who your audience is. Pretty much everyone knows who Beyonce is. She's pretty universally prominent. But Sylvia Earle, for example, is more prominent in ocean research and conservation spaces. But if you ask someone who's not in those spaces who she is, they probably won't know. So the idea here is, if you can link your story to someone who's prominent, then people will be more interested in it. Next up is timeliness. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but if the research was released last week, then it's timely. But if the research was released a year ago, then it's not timely anymore. But that doesn't mean you can't do a story about it. You just need a better reason than timeliness. But stories can become timely, or research can become timely later. So say there's a story about a volcanic eruption that's happening right now. So that's a timely story. But say you published a paper a year ago that predicted that of this particular volcano would erupt within the next decade. So now that research has become timely again because it's of the current event that has now made it timely. So the fourth one is novelty or oddity. So this is pretty self-explanatory. If something's weird, people will definitely want to hear about it. This one's great for science stories. There are plenty of strange and fascinating discoveries that happen, and it's like funny looking sea creatures with interesting traits. Some audiences can also find a specific location to be a novelty on its own, especially remote and inhospitable climates. A lot of researchers tend to take their amazing fieldwork locations for granted. So this is one thing that you should definitely be thinking about. Fifth is consequence. So if you're talking about a new finding that's linked to climate change, that's automatically going to have consequence, but you can also have local consequence. So maybe you're studying a local fishery that's on the brink of collapse. So that could have a big consequence for a specific fishing community. Next is conflict. And most stories have some form of conflict. So this can mean human versus human versus the forces of nature, human versus themselves, like an internal struggle. So I'm trying to think of some examples here in research of a story that has conflict. So maybe you're fighting to get funding to keep your research afloat. Hopefully I'm not hitting any nerves here. It's not too real. But there's definitely plenty of stories with conflict. Next up, we have human interest. So this is anything that makes you feel emotions, whether it's a heartwarming story or a really sad story. Journalists love if there's a human interest aspect to research. Did you somehow triumph over unimaginable odds? Did something tragic happen that you overcame? A lot of scientists forget to talk about the sort of touchy-feely aspects of their work, but if you can make that link, you might reach a different audience that would otherwise not pay as much attention. If someone feels emotionally connected to your story, they're more likely to absorb the information. Just make sure it's genuine because you don't want to manipulate people. Next up is extremes. For this, I mean, was there a record broken? A new coldest temperature ever recorded in Antarctica is newsworthy because it's extreme. But you have to be careful with this one, again, not to exaggerate something so that it becomes extreme. Scandal is the next one, pretty self-explanatory. When something bad happens, people are often interested. You have Watergate, the classic example of a scandal. Meghan and Harry leaving the royal family in the UK, another big scandal. In Canada, we had Elbowgate. I'm not going to get into that one. That was a small scale scandal. So all sorts of scandals. And finally, impact. If a lot of people will be impacted by something, the more newsworthy it is. So a new electric car battery factory opening in the small town where I live called Arendal, it's only going to impact the 40,000 people who live here. Also, if you recognize the name, yes, it is from the Disney Frozen movie. But a new Amazon warehouse opening in New York is going to impact millions of people who live here. So again, impact can be subjective given your audience, which leads me to the section on who's your audience. So throughout the 10 elements of newsworthiness, you'll notice that I added the caveat that a lot of elements depend on who your audience is. Now, some would argue there's only one wrong answer to this question. And I hope there's no one who feels personally attacked here, because we're all guilty of trying to create media that appeals to everyone. But what you don't realize is that not narrowing it down can be a huge detriment. Because if you try to make everyone happy, you'll make no one happy. As scientists, I'm sure you all know that when you're talking about your work to your peers or a policymaker or your grandparents, you're going to use different language and different arguments, or at least I really hope you do. So I'll just share a little story. So one of my undergraduate journalism professors, he was a retired CBC journalist. And so the CBC is kind of like the BBC, it's a public broadcaster. And someone asked him, who is the CBC's audience? And this is how specific he got. He said that he pictured the CBC audience as a 50-something-year-old woman, a librarian, based in Manitoba. So every time he was putting together a radio broadcast, he would think to himself if this 50-year-old librarian would be interested in his piece. And it's like kind of brilliant if you think about it. She's educated and curious. She has the kind of knowledge where she knows a little bit about a lot of different things. She's in her 50s. So if a story had a lot of like kind of cutting edge tech or jargon that the youths are using these days, he'd have to explain it to her. And geographically, she's in the middle of the country, which is kind of an overlooked area. So, you know, he's not saying something that, you know, only Toronto people are going to know. So if you think about it, there are a lot of people whose interests would definitely overlap with her interests. And if you do a story and it didn't pass that test, so if he didn't think she would be interested in it, he would either change the story and kind of workshop it and work on it so that she would be interested, or he would move on to something else. So now we're going to talk about some things that you should consider about your audience. Is your audience focused in a particular geographic location? If your audience is likely in the US, you may want to convert any measurements to the imperial system or use Fahrenheit, as painful as this might be. For monetary value, since I'm in Norway, we will probably want to quote things in kroners. And that's great if the audience that I'm targeting is in Norway. But if I'm aiming for a more general European audience or even a global audience, maybe I'll do the euro conversion in brackets, or just think of a less niche currency. How scientifically literate is your audience? Or what kind of level of education? Are you targeting people who are already experts in the field and you want them to actually learn something new? Or on the other extreme, are you writing an explainer that will be used for kids in primary school? Because the level of detail here is going to be very different. So think about climate change, for example. It is important that simplistic explainers on, say, the greenhouse effect exist. But if your audience is climate scientists, they know the greenhouse effect quite well. So your story won't hold their attention if you're going over that. How old is your audience? If you're going to make a reference to anything, will your intended audience get it? If your intended audience includes anyone under 20 years old and you mention a fax machine or a film canister, they might not have any idea what you're talking about. So same goes for young people trying to reach an older audience. So it goes both ways. So you've got to pinpoint who your audience is and make sure that your content is made with them in mind. Finally, you need to consider the political and religious beliefs of your audience. So an example here is Nova. It's the biggest science TV program in the US. While you can access Nova documentaries online, their audience is primarily cable TV viewers in the US, which naturally skews older and more conservative. But it's also used a lot in classrooms in North America. So Nova has to keep this in mind when producing science documentaries to avoid any hot button issues or political references that could be contentious, because they know that they have the opportunity to reach people and shape their views on science, whether that's kids in a classroom or their grandparents watching TV. So for a documentary about climate change, instead of starting off talking to a scientist about projections about the climate, they talk to a conservative weatherman who talks about how he didn't believe in climate change and how he changed his mind. So they try to remain as politically neutral as they can, and they talk to a variety of people with different political views who have a common understanding of the science. So all this to say, every decision you make will help you gain some people and lose others. And not making that decision of who you're targeting is the worst, because your work can look unfocused. So now we're straying a little bit away from journalism 101 and getting into the more comms and advocacy side of things. But it's important to consider, what is the goal of your story? Because knowing the goal of your story can also help narrow down who your audience is. Increased awareness. Do you want to inform people of something new or something that's under the radar? Enjoyment. Are you telling your audience about something that's fun or funny? Maybe it's a quirky feel-good story, because here you can have a little bit of a lighter tone. Are you hoping your story is something your audience will be interested in? Here it's going to be essential to pique your audience's interest with a good intro or title, pull them in, and make sure you can deliver. Then you get into opinion forming. Do you want to change someone's mind on a topic they may already be leaning one way on? Or do you want to help form an opinion on a new topic? This relates back to the audience section where I talked about politics and beliefs. Whose opinion do you want to change is going to drastically impact the kind of arguments that you make. Then there's understanding. Do you want to explain something? This can be a new concept that you're explaining or something we're all familiar with, but maybe don't fully understand or need a refresher. And finally, is there an action that you want your audience to take? Do you want them to write a letter to their local representative? Or is your audience policymakers and your goal is to get them to push forward a specific piece of legislation? If this is your aim, maybe you should have a call to action in your story. So now we're going to move on to which medium fits your story best. Remember, you can tell almost any story in any different medium, but some stories are going to lend themselves better to one medium or another. Sometimes it just makes sense to pick your medium based on what skills you have. For example, if you're a great writer, you have absolutely no interest in photography, you don't want to force yourself to do a photo essay. But if you're pitching your story to a journalist, this can also be helpful to think about what kind of journalist or publication would find your story most interesting. And it's just generally useful for you to be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses of your story. If your research is focused on trace elements in the ocean, for example, you probably won't pitch it to National Geographic because they want something that's going to produce photos. And it's going to be a bit more challenging for that kind of story. Instead, you might go to Scientific American, which is a place that's more focused on written stories and less on the visuals. So what makes a good written story? So if there's a lot of data in your story, if you're blending perspectives from a lot of different people and dealing with a complex topic, chances are the best way to do that is by writing a story in clear and concise language. There is a lot of opportunity to simplify complex topics with good writing, and you can even use visual aids alongside your writing to further clarify data. Which brings me to graphic design and animation. If you have a very visual story, but you can't get video or photos of it very easily, then graphic design or animation might be a great option. It can also be a great way to display data in a more accessible way if it's a more complex story. What makes a good audio story? So anything that has a unique sound. If you're, say you're a whale researcher and you've recorded these beautiful whale songs and you want to tell a story about a new hidden meaning that you've uncovered in them. Whoever hears about this story is immediately going to want to hear what those whale sounds actually sound like. So maybe you'll consider telling this story through podcasting. I mean, you could also do a video, but then you have to get underwater visuals. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So audio could be a good option. What makes a good photo story? So in particular, if your story is focused on an interesting place or biome, maybe you want to do a photo essay. Because even if you're extremely skilled at describing it with words, chances are your audience will want to see it with their own eyes. So photo essays can also be great at documenting change over a long period of time. If you're consistently returning to the same location, your photos from the same spot year after year can show a lot of change. And what makes a good video story? If your story involves a lot of action and movement, an event, a moment of discovery, of course, you're going to want to get that on video. One example of this is right before the pandemic, I joined a team of researchers in Sierra Leone who were looking for seagrass. Basically, they knew that seagrass had been found off the coast of neighboring West African countries, but no one had ever confirmed that seagrasses exist in Sierra Leone. So this team of researchers went out to look for seagrass in this place that they'd heard reports of it being spotted. And after an entire day on a boat to get to the location, one of the researchers who's a local, she's from there, found seagrass for the first time in her country. And it was a very exciting moment. And because the camera was rolling, we have video of that moment. And so this is the kind of video that is just absolutely priceless to be able to get. And so if you're ever lucky to kind of get to film these kind of moments, then have that camera rolling. But there are more than just the 5 more traditional mediums that I mentioned. So you can get pretty creative. Some of the ideas on this list are more serious than others. But the point here is that there are no one-size-fits-all rules for science storytelling. There's a lot of room for innovation and creativity. You never know what's going to reach someone. And remember, good, thoughtful storytelling skills are universal. They apply to every medium, just presented in slightly different ways. So if people want to write in the chat some forms of science storytelling that you came across that you thought were really interesting or effective, please do. I think we'd all love to read them. Just to mention one, my partner works in cybersecurity, and recently he was very hyped to find a board game that teaches cybersecurity concepts. So you never know. Now, in a moment, we're going to zoom in on social media and vlogging, since these are particularly accessible ways to communicate your work. But first, we're going to focus on traditional media. How do scientists get their work in the news? Well, speaking to you as someone who has never been a scientist, but has been a journalist, and a lot of times it's the journalist chasing the scientist for stories, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can make it easier for the journalist, which is absolutely a win-win situation for everyone. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's talk briefly about how stories get assigned in a newsroom. So one way is perhaps your organization writes a press release about some new findings. That press release usually gets sent to a tip line at various newspapers and media organizations, but sometimes it can also get sent directly to editors and reporters. But usually there's someone whose job it is to monitor the tip line. So if your press release stands out, then they will give it to the editor. And if the editor thinks that it's worth covering, they will assign it to a reporter, usually a general reporter, unless it's a publication that has a specialized science reporter. And then that journalist reports on the story and it gets published. Now, from an efficiency standpoint, this is a great option because you only have to write that one press release, and then you can just blast it off to every publication that you'd like to consider your story. But there are some higher risks that your story might get missed since it has to go through so many steps to finally get onto the reporter's desk. So a slightly more labor-intensive but potentially higher reward way of getting your story noticed by reporters is to write a personalized pitch to an editor or a reporter. And if the reporter finds your story interesting, then they'll pitch it to their editor. And if their editor agrees, then it gets made. Now, if you want to go to the next level, you all know journalists love timely news. Well, you can actually send them a draft of your paper a few days before it's released, along with your personalized email to them and the press release. And just make it very clear that there is an embargo on the information, and then let them know that it will be released, when it will be released, and they will be free to publish. So this way, the journalists have more time to put together a story and still get to publish it in a really timely manner. But if you're going to do this, make sure you clear it with the journal where you're publishing, but they should have policies in place. This is not an uncommon thing. Now I want to talk about ways that you can connect with journalists outside of just those moments when new findings or papers are about to be published. So first off, you may be wondering, how do you even find journalists to get in touch with? If you want to do it the more passive way, you can join a database of scientists who are willing to be contacted as sources for stories. This way you can get journalists to come to you. So there are databases that anyone can join, but in particular, if you're a researcher who's part of an underrepresented community, there are databases specifically for people of color, women, LGBTQ scientists, etc. And of course, they're all organized by topic. So the journalists can make sure that you have a relevant background to what they're asking you to speak to. So I can share a link at the end that has a list of a bunch of different databases. But if you want to take more initiative, journalists actually make it incredibly easy for you to contact them. A lot of journalists will have their emails publicly available on their Twitter bios, on their websites, or even their phone numbers. So I would advise that you find a journalist whose work you've read and you like, and reach out to them. And a small tip, journalists do get a lot of hate mail. So fan mail can be more unusual and lovely. So that's a great way to initiate contact by mentioning a story that they wrote that you liked, introducing yourself, and maybe offering to help if they need a source with a certain subject matter expertise that you have. If they take you up on that, it may mean exchanging some emails or taking a call from them when they're working on a story related to your field. But which journalists to contact? General reporters are often more junior reporters. They're given assignments on a variety of different topics. So it's going to make a lot more sense for you to get in touch with a reporter who's covering a science-related beat. Now, beat is a term used in journalism to mean a topic. So you can have a reporter on a science beat, which is more broad, or maybe a climate beat, which is now narrowing it down a little bit. Beat reporters often have a lot more experience, and sometimes they even have a bit of background in the topic that they're covering. So these are the ones that you want to get a hold of. Another way to build rapport with journalists is to share tips about relevant research that they might not know about, even if it's not your own research. So this is a great way to build credibility because you don't have any skin in the game. You just genuinely think this is interesting and relevant and could be a story they would want to cover. And now that you know the 10 elements of newsworthiness and how to ask the who, what, when, where, why, and how, you have a much higher chance of sending them a tip that they will act on. And finally, I want to talk a bit about deadlines. In some fields or organizations, deadlines are more flexible than others, but journalism is not one of those fields. If you don't get that piece of information on time, it's not going to make it into your story. If you don't file your story on time, sometimes the story gets killed. So as a potential source, try to be as prompt as you can. If the ice sheet is collapsing right now and you're a glaciologist who's studying it, yes, your research comes first, but take those 5 minutes to reply to the journalist's email, or take those 20 minutes to talk to them on the phone, because it's in your best interest to have more people than just you and your colleagues informed and caring about your work. And I can't tell you how many times I've emailed a scientist about a story and gotten an automatic out of office response saying, "Hi there, I'm on a glacier for the next 2 months and will not be responding to emails." So I just have to either find someone else with similar expertise, or sometimes the story just doesn't get made. So that's like, now this is a bit difficult because like it's kind of hard to find a solution for that. So but maybe it's good to consider including in your out of office reply for any media inquiries. Please contact this other colleague with similar expertise who's currently not doing field work. But that's just a suggestion. But overall, I just want to highlight that this is one of the biggest pain points for journalists. And so it's important that we kind of think about how we can work together. Now we're going to talk about when you might decide to pitch your story to a journalist versus when you might decide to create some content yourself. You can also do both of these things at the same time, but I do want to go over the pros and cons of each so that you know what you're getting yourself into, and you can decide what you want to focus your energy on. So the pros of pitching your story to the media include the fact that you don't need to build an audience over time. So if your story gets published, then it will reach the publication's audience. Publishing can also mean less work for you because you don't need to produce the media. The journalists will be putting the story together, and sure, you'll probably have to do an interview, but it's a lot less work than creating the media yourself. Then, depending on the publication and depending on your communication and media skills, the work that the journalist does is often, hopefully, more polished and professional than what you could produce. Of course, there's a scale, and if it's a trashy tabloid doing the story about your work versus a publication with a large newsroom, that's going to be different. And finally, the recognition can be beneficial. You're not only giving back to society by making the public aware of your work, but if your work aims to recommend some sort of policy change, media attention means that there's a higher likelihood that it's going to be taken seriously. And additionally, media attention can help you in future funding applications because funders just love to see that kind of impact. Now, the cons of pitching to the media is you don't get to control what they publish. Of course, most media do a good job of reporting, but you're always taking that risk that your story is going to get assigned to a really fresh general reporter who failed all their science high school classes. Please don't let this deter you, though. In part 2, we're actually going to go over some strategies for when you're being interviewed by journalists to make sure they get the story right. The next point is that pitching your story can require a lot of emailing, coordinating, lots of logistical back and forth stuff, which if you personally find that draining, maybe you would enjoy more creative tasks when you're not doing your main job. And finally, you have to be prepared that sometimes it's just not going to work out. Maybe you haven't quite found your story's hook and it's not resonating with people. Maybe you've done everything right, but there's way too many big world events, which, last 2 years. And so maybe no one's just picking up your story, even though you're pitching it. So stuff happens and it can get discouraging, and it's totally valid if people just don't want to deal with that and decide they'd rather create their own content. So the main pro of creating content yourself, I would argue, is that it can be very fun and rewarding. But this isn't one size fits all. So I think it's really important to find your niche within science communication. Find the thing you can do that's fun and doesn't feel like a chore, and focus on that. But you also get to build your skills over time. Maybe you'll learn photography or video editing. Maybe you'll develop a following on social media and get really good at marketing yourself. You never know. But if you make a plan and stick to it, you're bound to pick up some new skills over time. Another pro is that you control the message, so you can make sure that every detail is accurate. And finally, while getting your work published in traditional media is great recognition that can help your work, there's a different kind of recognition if you create content yourself. So if you write an op-ed and get it published somewhere, you'll get that byline. If you build a large social media following or host a photography exhibition, these are really impressive accomplishments that others will hopefully take notice of. So now for the cons. You likely won't reach as many people. Most newspapers have circulations in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. And you have to be very lucky and or very persistent to grow your social media following that large, or get the media that you created published somewhere with that large of a circulation. It's also a lot more work, and it's creative work, which can be draining if you're not really excited about it. And finally, when you first start out, you might not be as talented. So maybe your photos didn't turn out as nice when you first start taking them. Or maybe you start writing blogs and your writing isn't quite as concise in the first few entries. So these are some of the challenges that getting started, and sometimes like getting through and being consistent and improving your skills, it can be just difficult to get started, and that's totally normal. So if you decide to create content yourself, one of the ways you might decide to do this is by doing science blogging on social media. And what I mean by science blogging are videos where you share information in an informal way, almost speaking directly to your audience. And I've decided to talk a little bit about vlogging, but you could also call it becoming an influencer, as cringy as that might sound, because I've looked a bit at what's out there in the space, and unlike like travel and health and fitness influencers, I think there's a lot of space for more science bloggers or science influencers. Not enough of you guys are out there sharing your research. We need to drown out all the disinformation that gets shared on social media with some good content. So I hope I'll inspire some people today. So if you decide to do some vlogging or influencing, one of your first questions may be, which platform should you choose? Well, my biggest recommendation is to pick the platform that you like the most and actually use in your day-to-day. Because vlogging and posting on social media is something that you should do because it's fun, or because you feel motivated to challenge yourself to get your research out into the world. But if you find it just really uninteresting and boring, or just overly uncomfortable and not in a positive personal growth kind of way, then maybe it's just not for you, and that's totally okay. But regardless, you should be aware of some of the differences between the platforms, so you can tailor your content to the platform and the audience that it attracts. So some of the questions you'll want to ask yourself are, how much time do you want to spend editing? Because Instagram and TikTok don't instantly require you to learn how to edit videos. TikTok in particular is made to be able to edit the whole thing in-app. And Instagram also allows you to do some editing in-app, but it's a little bit less options than TikTok. So some Instagrammers may start editing with external editing programs as their skills advance. But YouTube, if you go for YouTube, you have to learn how to edit videos right from the beginning. So this leads into, how long do you want your videos to be? If you like telling more involved stories that have lots of nuance and combine different storylines, and you like shooting scenes and B-roll, then maybe YouTube is a better option. But if you want to do quick and concise videos, then TikTok and Instagram will be better options for you. YouTube tends to have quite high production value, and that's totally fine if you're not at that level right away, because as long as you have good storytelling, you can still gain traction on the site. But if you have pretty basic camera or camera phone, and you don't see yourself upgrading or getting into filming, and you prefer to shoot in portrait mode, then that's a sign that maybe Instagram or TikTok might be a better option for you. You'll also want to ask yourself, who is your most likely audience? Or do you want your audience to, or who do you want your audience to be? For example, if you want to reach under 25s, you might go for TikTok. If you want to reach millennials, maybe Instagram. If you want to reach a wider demographic, maybe YouTube is the place for you. That's not to say that you can't create content aimed at one demographic and then post it on whatever platform you'd like, but you should keep the demographics in mind. Finally, a few more big picture considerations. First of all, if you think you may consider monetizing your videos in the future, YouTube makes it much easier to do that. And it's also much easier to share YouTube videos because people don't need an app to watch them. You can share TikTok and Instagram links, but user experience isn't going to be great if people don't have those apps downloaded. So they're more likely to share a YouTube video link than like in a tweet or in a Facebook post. And finally, I will mention that there can be a huge benefit to being an early adopter for a platform. So this is less the case for TikTok now than it was in, say, the summer of 2020. But when you jump on a bandwagon for something that's new and niche, you have more of a chance of getting noticed and going viral because you're competing with fewer people. Though the downside of that is you will also reach fewer people at first, at least, because they might not have a large user base. And it doesn't, you know, sometimes it's a bit of a gamble. You don't know if it's going to take off. You'll notice that I haven't mentioned Facebook or Twitter here. That's because I find that Twitter is not really made for vlogs exactly. And I haven't talked about Facebook because in recent years, it's been kind of struggling with an aging demographic. And it's not like specifically made for a kind of video. It's more you would share something that you made for a different platform on Facebook. So first, let's talk a little bit about YouTube. So one study I found from the Frontiers in Communication Journal examined 306 popular science YouTube videos from 52 different channels to look at trends and indicators of popularity. So now these recommendations are specific to YouTube, and I do have to mention that each social media platform has slightly different demographics, and interestingly, the YouTube demographic is on average more educated than other social media platforms. So what did they find? A popular science video on YouTube is likely to be a 12-minute story about an emotionally activating journey towards an answer to a science-related question raised at the beginning, with a twist in the middle and a revelation at the end. So it's a lot to think about. But again and again, I stumbled across papers that stressed that effective science communication follows a narrative, a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this one was no exception. And stories that elicit an emotional response are more likely to be shared and drive engagement. But I need to stress that this does not mean manufacturing drama and emotion where there is none, because you don't want your audience to feel misled. And with regards to the moment of change or twist in the story, one way to achieve that is, say your story includes a researcher as a character. I guarantee that the process was not completely smooth. So show the challenges that they faced. Show when the research was not going great and how they overcame it. Audiences love transparency, and especially if people are dealing with things with good humor, people are going to connect with it. Now the point about the 12-minute average length. So this is very platform specific. So if you're trying to develop a popular YouTube channel, focusing on longer videos would make a lot of sense. But 3 minutes is really the sweet spot for Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, since users on those platforms are scrolling, and YouTube users tend to commit more to the content. Now I'm going to highlight an interesting case study from 2017 that echoes a lot of other articles I've read, but focuses on one single science communication campaign. As part of her master's degree, Sophie Pavel designed a case study to measure the impact of science and environmental communication on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. She undertook a 3-week, 300-mile scientific trek around the coast of Cornwall in the UK. She filmed, edited, and shared vlogs every day on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for 22 days, around 5 to 7 minutes each. For 2 months prior to the trip, she partnered with local nature trusts, her university, and local media and scientific organizations to share information about her trek to attract followers. She also tracked analytics on her accounts for 1 week prior, the 3 weeks during, and 1 week after her trek. Then she sent out an online survey to collect data on viewer engagement. So in the results of her study, her Facebook followers increased by 75%. Her Twitter followers increased by 300%. Her YouTube subscribers increased by 1,000%. And the biggest increase, a 3-fold increase, was on Instagram to 1,000 followers. So this makes complete sense to me why her Instagram following saw the most gains, because I went and I looked at the content she was sharing across all platforms, and the photos and captions that she was sharing on Instagram had much higher production value than the content on her YouTube, which was reshared on Twitter and Facebook. So the vast majority of people following her trek were locals, also from the southern UK. The most popular videos were those that presented a lot of highlights and action, such as multiple encounters with wildlife, depth of scientific information, or striking landscapes. The videos that had the most engagement, so comments, likes, and shares, included more dramatic scenes, such as physical injury or emotional content, which again tracks with the most recent study that looked at the most popular science videos on YouTube. So I think this really speaks to the power of storytelling campaigns versus one-off video or articles or photos. People were clearly rooting for Sophie, and her story had a clear beginning, which was she's undertaking this massive trek as part of her master's thesis, a middle where things happened during the trek. She had challenges, she had injuries, gear malfunctions, and of course, exciting wildlife sightings. So things happened, and then an end where she triumphs and she finishes her trek. So what can we take away from this case study? That infotainment or educational entertainment is a huge driver of audience engagement. So she argues in the discussion section of her case study that social media engagement with science content in this way acts as a gateway for deeper engagement with scientific topics. And other studies support the notion that if you make it more enjoyable for people to engage with scientific content, they'll have more positive connotations, which overall leads to increased interest and trust in science, which we really need. Second of all, engaging with the local audience is key. The majority of engagement came from locals, which does make sense because she partnered with local organizations to spread the word about her trek, but also the nature of the work she was doing was primed for a local audience. She was revealing interesting facts about wildlife and landscapes in their own backyard. In this case, in the local language, which was English. But if the trek was happening along the southern coast of Norway, for example, I imagine you'd see a loss in local engagement if the trek was not happening in Norwegian. In her post-trek questionnaire, respondents said that they enjoyed feeling like they got to know Sophie through her trek, and it made the science more personal and more approachable. So study after study has shown that consistent presenters in science content drives audience engagement. So YouTube series with consistent presenters do better than channels that switch up their presenters. When people see the same person consistently, they feel like they get to know them, and they're more likely to trust them. So this makes complete sense to me. And finally, the ability to follow events in near real time drove engagement. So I think this really hits on the point that timeliness is essential when you're producing stories specifically for social media. Of course, there is a time and place for longer, nuanced stories, and there is also a place for quick hits as they're happening. It makes people feel engaged. Before we draw to a close and take questions, I want to highlight one study I came across, which I think is really important. So this one might seem obvious, but studies have shown that scientific discourse carried out in the native language of a target audience yields greater participation, motivation, and optimism, and leads to stronger connections to concepts. So a 2020 paper published in Frontiers in Communication cautions that simple translations of existing content are insufficient to capture attention and present complex information in an understandable manner. So for example, instead of translating existing metaphors, translations should employ culturally relevant metaphors, experiences, and storytelling approaches. That same article goes as far as to recommend that researchers should write their papers first in their native language and then translate them to English instead of succumbing to the pressure to publish in English first, as this will yield more meaningful engagement with their community. So I know this is a linguistically diverse group. So for all the folks listening who were lucky enough to have been raised with a mother tongue other than English, this could be something to consider. And now I will leave you with this story checklist. So whenever you think you have a great science story, just go through these points and it will help you determine if there's something there. So the first thing is to answer the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the story. Then you should go through the elements of newsworthiness. Check off any that apply. Does it have proximity, prominence, timeliness, novelty, consequence, conflict, human interest, scandal, or impact? Then you should identify who your audience is and get very specific here. What's their education level, political views, age, where are they located, what language do they speak? Then you should determine which medium fits your story best. Is this an audio story, video, graphic design, writing, photography, or a mixture of two or more? And finally, determine what you're trying to achieve with your story. Do you want to increase the awareness of your audience about a particular subject? Is this for their enjoyment or interest? Do you want to help shape opinions or increase understanding? Do you want them to take a particular action? Do you want them to consume this media and then go write a letter to a politician or click on a link and sign a petition or change a behavior at home? So you should identify this goal early on and have it at the top of mind as your story is coming together. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for listening. And now I guess I'll check with Sabrina. Had there been any questions?
Yes, there have. Yes. Thank you so much for everyone who submitted a question, and also for your patience in waiting for it. If I didn't reply to you immediately, some of the questions I could reply immediately, but I'll make sure I go through all of them now for everyone. The first one was, will we receive a certificate of attendance? From Raquel Almeida. I replied to her already that she could just email me. So we hadn't planned on doing that for everyone since there were hundreds that signed up for this webinar. But if you do need that or would find it useful, just email me. My email is sabrina.heerema, HEEREMA @GRIDA, GRIDA.no. You can also find my email on GRID-Arendal's webpage. The second one was, will we share the slides afterwards? you want me to answer? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the video will be shared. So, but do people want the actual PowerPoint? Because I can share that.
Yeah, okay. So if you're open to sharing that, that's fine. But I did reply to a few that we would definitely be sharing the video on the Apex and Arctic Passion YouTube channels. The last question that came into, has this session been recorded? Yes, it has. So that's why we'll be reposting the video on YouTube. Okay, so then Olivia, we have to discuss whether you want to share the slides or not, but the video will definitely be made public and shared with everyone.
Yeah, I can share the slides too. That's no problem.
Great. Where would you share the slides?
What do you both think? how is that?
Maybe we can also post a link under the YouTube video so that everything is accessible in the same place, and we just have to find a good solution for sharing the slides in the cloud.
Okay.
The third question was, can I share this link on LinkedIn or publicly afterwards?
To the YouTube video? Absolutely.
I think they meant the link to this Zoom meeting, so I did answer immediately that they could share that. Yeah, but also the YouTube video, yes. How long will the seminar last? This one was 1 hour, and then the following one is planned to be 1 hour as well. There was a longer question, number 5. What do you do with EU projects when the European Commission requires dissemination with all possible stakeholders? So that means the full cross-section of society, such as scientists, entrepreneurs, etc. Preparing content for only one group won't meet the European Commission requirements, but preparing for all will cause chaos. Even if we narrow the group down to users of specific social media, the scope of potential audiences for some projects, for example, related to climate change, will be massive. How to reconcile it in EU projects?
That is a very difficult question. Yes. And I mean, I think perhaps the answer is that you can almost, I mean, maybe you can create different products. So if you're required to communicate to many different stakeholders, maybe you're creating kind of different projects that are slightly more targeted. I mean, you can basically make your target a little bit broader so that you're not like, you know, really getting too specific. But you still, as I mentioned before, like if you're aiming for a 50-year-old librarian in Manitoba, you're still going to reach a lot of people. Like that's actually a very kind of in the middle target for you to have. But I think it's just kind of important to think about these things, because, you know, you might, if you're not thinking about these things, like what if you put in like some sort of jargon that a really young person will get, and then later you put some jargon in that like a much older person will get. So I think like if you kind of you split the difference, you aim for someone sort of in the middle that can catch a lot more people, then it's just better. You're just a little bit more focused.
Yeah, thanks very much for that answer. The next question from Christoph was, does it make sense to send a full article as a press release containing all resources such as photos?
Usually you don't do that. It's better to send your press release, and then when the journalist or the editor will get back to you, then you can start having that conversation about sending additional media. And as I mentioned before, you know, if instead of just sending the press release, like you can kind of send like a personalized pitch, and you can say, and you can explain more that you have these photos, you can write an article, like you can kind of talk a little bit more, but basically just kind of open that conversation before sending media. And also make sure that you're not pitching, like, so if you're pitching a story that you've written, make sure that you pitch it to one place at a time, because you don't want to pitch it to like 10 places and then 2 of them email you back and are interested, and then you have to pick. That's like not a good practice. So pitch it one place at a time. And if you get ghosted, which does happen, then just send, like, you know, wait a week, send a follow-up email and say, hey, I'm going to move on and be pitching it to this next place. So let me know in 2 days if you're interested. And then if you don't hear back, then just pitch it to the next place.
Thanks, Olivia. The next question was from Matilda. With regards to capturing an exciting moment on film, would you suggest having a constant camera rolling or documentation during fieldwork or research, just in case, or is it better to reenact the moment after the event?
Olivia, just shortly, can you stop sharing your screen? Then a little bit better.
Sorry. I completely forgot about that. Yes. Okay. So for important moments of discovery, yeah, so that's a really hard one. Because yeah, if you have like absolutely no idea that it's going to happen, then it's going to take a lot of battery power, a lot of like memory, like for your camera and all this stuff to just like constantly have a camera recording. So I think like the best like kind of middle ground would be to have a camera like ready and accessible, like you know, have someone who like we're going to talk about this in the media production session, the second part. But like to kind of have someone who like they know that they're the person who's going to be doing the video content or the photos, to kind of like assign roles a little bit. And then just make sure that I would say have a camera really close by, so you're ready. So like if something's happening, just pull it up, because, you know, in the seconds and minutes afterwards, it's still very exciting. So I would say that's probably the best option.
Thank you. Can we contact Olivia via email after the seminar, or a popular request? What social media are you on, and what are those? Yeah, what are those?
I feel like a bit of a hypocrite, because I actually I got locked out of my Twitter recently, and I haven't been on there in like 2 months. And I haven't been posting on, I'm really bad right now on social media. I mean, you can follow the GRID. GRID has a good Instagram. You can find me on Instagram too. I'll probably come back and start posting again. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm not like, I'm not living the lifestyle. But yes, and then definitely email me. I believe like all of my contact information is public on the GRID website. You can find my email there. But yeah, so feel free to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you if any of these tips have helped, or if you just want to like chat a little bit about something, definitely open to it.
Thanks. Okay, new question from Cynthia. My last Mars paper generated interest from a non-legit suspicious fellow with remarkably bad politics. I ignored his request for info and let him write whatever he wanted without my personal assistance. He wasn't an actual science reporter. What would you have done in this case?
Oof. Yeah, that's a pretty tough one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, that's the thing, is I'm not a scientist, so I don't know what I would have done in that situation. Yeah, I mean, I think it's everyone's kind of personal decision whether you want to just ignore it, which is totally valid and legitimate, and you know, I'm sure like anyone important was probably not paying attention to this kind of non-legitimate journalist. But, you know, some people, if you're really like, you know, it's this whole debate. Like, you remember when Bill Nye, the science guy, like debated a creationist, you know, like there's a whole debate, and there's like, do you engage with the person with the fringe beliefs, or do you just not engage? Because there's no really right answer there. Like, there's issues with engaging and there's issues with not engaging. So it's like, that's a hard one. And I think it really depends on the person. And so, you know, if you're like a really confident public speaker, maybe like you've done a lot of interviews, maybe you're like, yeah, sure, I'm just going to take this interview. And but you know, then if you don't want to engage, then that's also a valid decision. So I think it really depends on the person.
Yeah, I would have done what you did, Cynthia.
Me too.
Just for your information. The next question, but how long should these videos, as in the YouTube videos, be? How to fit the content for length? I think you answered that after the question came.
Yeah, like I think 12 minutes is considered like kind of the sweet spot. And that's also like a really good, like if you're planning to monetize later, like 12 minutes, like you can have like the ads in there, and it basically gives you like more money. I know that's bad to think about, but like sometimes like you want it to be an additional revenue stream, then that's a good thing to think about. And yeah, so YouTube videos are getting longer and longer. Like you see like 20-minute videos and people will watch them. Like it's quite impressive. Like it's so different with TikTok and Instagram and these really short video platforms where it has to be like a minute, not too much more. And then YouTube is just completely the opposite. So it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Another question from I know. I'm a science communication specialist and content creator. Is it okay if I use Olivia's slides as a background information for a blog I'll be writing? And I would like to credit her, of course, and give readers the original source. Is it possible to get a link?
Yeah, that sounds fine to me. Also, by the way, all of the photos that, or yeah, I think most of the photos, except the one that was credited, are photos that were taken by GRID-Arendal photographers. So, so you can actually, if you go on the GRID-Arendal website, you can go on the Flickr, and you can actually use any of those photos in your material, as long as you're not profiting off of them, and just credit GRID and whoever the photographer is. So it's all on our Flickr account, so you can use any of them. It's pretty awesome, and not enough people know about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. I also mentioned to a few people that we will be posting these recorded videos on the Apex and Arctic Passion YouTube channels afterwards. So if you keep your eye on those channels, the video should appear maybe tonight or at the latest tomorrow. And there we'll make sure to link up to these things that you're asking about as well. Another question is, what is the title of the article on communicating in native language?
I would have to go back into some notes. I'm going to take a note, and I'm going to link it in the YouTube video. I'm going to link the articles that I referenced.
I took a note, and I noted the person's name as well, so I can give you that note.
Okay.
The next question is, can you share links to studies published in Frontiers on Communication that you mentioned? Yes, definitely. I'll take all, I have the links in a document on my computer, and so I'll just, I'll add them to the description of the recording of this talk. Okay, great. How would you spice up a short interview videos with scientific content so that they drive more engagement? An interview. So I'd have to know a little bit more about the specifics. But if you're doing, so say you do an interview about like a science topic, and instead of just posting that interview, I would say add in some scenic footage, some B-roll, like that kind of stuff. Anything that, so in journalism, we say a dog, see a dog.
So if you're making a video and someone talks about a dog, you want to see a dog on the screen. So it's like kind of the same thing. So if you talk about something in the interview and you have footage or a photo of that, then try and incorporate that to keep your viewers engaged. So that would be my more general suggestion. But if you want to email me, I can and give some more details. I can also share my suggestions.
That's very kind of you. What would you recommend to someone trying to learn to edit, asking for a friend? Because editing is difficult, takes lots of time, and cannot seem to make it like a nice flowing video, and I have noticed how to improve this. Reason why I gave up trying again.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so that's the difficult thing is, I guess it really depends on how serious you are. So if you've already kind of tried to learn how to edit on your own, first of all, it depends on what program you tried using. Because, you know, some programs like Premiere Pro, for example, like there's just so many options, it can be a bit overwhelming. So maybe you use a more simple program like iMovie, or DaVinci Resolve is a really good one. It's totally free, and you can like upgrade to have more stuff, but like the main version is like very, it's like you can do a lot of things with it. And so yeah, so maybe first, depending on what editing program you tried first, maybe you try a different editing program. Second of all, I mean, some people just like learn better in a class. So if you were just kind of looking at resources online at first, and you were just overwhelmed and you just weren't picking it up, maybe you can join like a basic video editing class. That could be an option. Or, you know, there are more like kind of like paid like video editing, like online classes that you could maybe look into. But there's also in-person classes, which is amazing to have someone just like come behind you and like show how to do something. So yeah, so just kind of like look for more resources, I would say. And also another tip is watch, like, you know, sit down and watch some like documentaries or like some YouTube videos, or like stuff, like the kind of content that you would want to create in like once you're there, and just like analyze the cuts that they're making. Because yeah, like a lot of times, and also simple is better. You know, if you're just starting off video editing and you try to do all sorts of weird effects and you're like adding text and like all this stuff, it takes some time to get that stuff to look really nice. So maybe just start off like really simple, just like cutting between nice shots, and just be very minimalist. So yeah, I'm maybe a little bit all over the place, but yeah, I would say start small, watch content, look for a course.
Yeah, thanks very much, Olivia. I think we actually covered all of the questions, but there are some comments also. So since we have a little bit of time, we can take some time to go through them. The first comment was an example of another type of storytelling in science. So there's a link there that Dora posted. And then there was a comment, a couple of comments from different people. The first one was Evany Amor, about being a social media strategist, interesting in supporting scientists on their social media. You can find him or her on Instagram. So the address is there in the chat for those of you that are interested. There's another one from Heidi Silvestre, and she's also on Instagram, and her account is listed there. Yeah, a couple of comments to the things that you were presenting as well, and replies to some of the things that you were commenting on just now. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to take a look at and comment on right now, Olivia or Lisa, but I think we covered all of the questions. I hope if anyone else that's still here has any more questions, we're here for you, and you have a chance now to ask live.
Sounds great.
There's a lot of thank yous there for a good seminar. So,
Well, thanks for listening. I don't think I've presented to a group this large before. So this is awesome. And I hopefully it'll reach even more people once it's posted on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
thank you everybody for joining. And also when you have questions in the next days, you can always contact us, of course. And maybe a small reminder. So on Thursday, there will be the second seminar on media production in the field with the same group of people, with the 3 of us, and the same time as well. So it's 2 p.m. GMT. And yeah, if there are no more questions, I don't see that in the chat.
Thank you for all the comments.
Yes.
There's a lot of comments now.
Thank you, Olivia, also for making time and sharing your experience. And I think we got a lot of new insights, also how science communication can work and how we can start when we are new, because many of the audience were also new to the topic, or had some experience. So I think we learned a lot. And maybe see you on Thursday. And thank you all for joining, and have a good continuation of the day, and sending you best wishes, and take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.